All right, so everything's in order now. And I went ahead and muted everyone because we were getting a little bit of background noise. And I know you're all familiar with this at this point, and I just want to be as clear as possible. I invite contributions whenever you want to make them. So don't feel like you have to wait for me to pause and stop in order to ask a question. Just hit your space bar, hold it down, or hit the little microphone icon at the bottom of your screen, and you'll be able to unmute yourself and say whatever you want to say. And I'm just going to jump right in. And I want to start by refreshing your memory a little bit about what we were talking about last week. And we were talking about knowledge and the importance of reading in particular, that this is a central intellectual technology, that human culture and civilization took off when we invented written language, that the practice of reading to oneself is central to the ages of enlightenment and Renaissance and humanism in European civilization, that they awaited the printing press to make the written word not the province of an esoteric elite trained in Latin, but something available to the masses, to many people in the reading public. And that as a reading public developed, we got also eventually the democratic revolutions, right, that swept Europe in the 18th century, starting in many respects in this country. And so the idea that a technology can have deep formative effects on the human mind and brain, we see the difference in the density of the neural networks in the frontal cortex when people read or learn to read, when a society becomes a literate society, that it changes politics, that it changes culture, that it changes civilization. All of that, I think, is best illustrated perhaps by the technology of the written word, and then the so-called Gutenberg technology, the technology of the printed word. And we approached that last week by, and I actually don't want to do the review again, but by looking at Nicholas Carr's work, right? And in particular, his not most recent publication, but a relatively recent publication, one that got a lot of attention, The Shallows, What the Internet is Doing to Our Brain. And to review briefly, right, we talked about in general the importance of the way that we acquire knowledge. And this is in part for having well-grounded belief, not just believing what is true, but believing what is true for good reasons. And that in many respects, that's a social process, right? It's not an individual process. Most of us cannot verify most of what we take to be knowledge, but we believe we have reliable sources for our knowledge, that we live in a society, in a community in which experts check each other, in which they are free to go the direction that their inquiry takes them, and that the result is, if something is fundamentally flawed, sooner or later we will figure that out, and it will be exposed and replaced by more valid knowledge, right? And so we do want to acquire knowledge ourselves in reliable ways, but we also need to be part of an overall epistemic community or knowledge system that allows us to acquire knowledge in ways that tend to be reliable, verifiable, critical, in so that the knowledge of our society is reliable, and hence our individual knowledge is also reliable. And we spoke about the loss of two practices, conversation and reading. The time use studies indicate that the time we're spending on these devices, the third of our waking hours that go to being on a screen, are in fact crowding out other activities, chief among them conversation and reading, and that these are actually extremely important to the ways in which we acquire knowledge. And so it's not as if we're not still acquiring knowledge or information, but the mode in which we acquire it has changed, and the result may be that the reliability, the verifiability of the knowledge that we're acquiring has changed. May even be that we are becoming more susceptible to manipulation, to misinformation, right? And so we started last week with the idea that maybe a third of the American population appears to believe that the last election was stolen, that a very small number of us, a few hundred, invaded the Capitol based on that obviously fabricated piece of propaganda. And much, I think, in a sense, more dangerously, 43 states are considering changing their voting laws based on the fallacious idea that the election of 2020 was stolen. And so if we're living in a world in which a shared sense of reality has declined, and which a substantial portion of our public, our population, is inclined to believe things that are demonstrably false, we have to ask, how did this come to be? If this wasn't always the case, and I think clearly this was not the case a decade or 20 or 50 years ago. It's not as if America has never been prone to hysteria and to misapprehension of threats and dangers. There's such a thing as moral panic that leads to the distortion of what we believe, right? The Salem witch trials going all the way back to the very early years of colonial settlement in the United States, or what was then the colonies that became the United States, all the way forward to the Red Scare of the McCarthy era. We have been susceptible to a kind of exaggerated fear which distorts our sense of reality in the past. And there have been opportunistic leaders who take advantage of that. But it seems to me that what's going on today is different in kind and also different in terms of its order of magnitude. The ease with which disinformation is circulated, the propensity for people to believe it, the willingness of opportunistic leaders to take advantage of it, I think have all grown as a result of changes in our knowledge acquisition process, and the decline of some of the arts of self-fashioning, the way in which we become who we are through engaging in critical conversation, argumentation, discourse with the ones we consider to be significant in our lives, but also in broader contexts, and also the decline of reading, and especially reading of the printed word, which has been replaced for so many people by reading online. And I will try to argue with you that that's a fundamentally different mode of knowledge acquisition. It has profoundly different effects on the mind and the way in which we assimilate knowledge. So we talked additionally, and this is a separate factor, about the decline of gatekeepers, that there were, for most of the 20th century, many one-to-many media outlets, right? The editors of the major newspapers, the producers at the major television stations and radio stations controlled what got onto their pages and wavelengths, right? And the result is that not everyone who had an idea could get that idea published or gain publicity for it. And that for much of the 20th century, the practice of determining who got airtime, who got visibility and publicity, was governed by a set of professional ethics that included, among other things, verifiability. Right, that you weren't going to publish it unless and until you had checked the facts, you had made sure that the sources were reliable, that there were multiple sources, that they were saying the same thing, and that this didn't guarantee that everything that was printed or said in the media was true, right? Obviously, and to take a central example, we were deeply confused about the likelihood that Saddam Hussein's Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. And we went to war on the basis of that misunderstanding, right? To be clear, there were probably people in the administration of George W. Bush for whom manipulating that story was extremely important, but I don't think that means that the whole thing was propaganda. I think there were a bunch of journalists who were trying to do their job who became convinced that this was the case. And so you can make a mistake even in this world, and it can be a tremendously costly mistake. Note the millions of people, trillions of expenditure, billions of dollars of damage that war did. So these mistakes do happen even when you have a media system that is at least minimally functional in verifying information. But that media system is being displaced, at least in sectors of the information system, by an entirely different media system that operates on different principles. And so again, to review briefly, one of those principles is identity confirmation. Am I the kind of person I think I am? Is it good, virtuous to be that kind of person, right? And so the Fox News model seems to rest primarily on telling people that people like them believe the right thing and are good people because they believe it, right? And that in a sense, identity confirmation, telling their viewers that this is the right thing to believe and this is a good way to be, is more important than verifiable knowledge, right? And so this is one value that is determining what circulates in our media sphere, that competes with and in portions of the media ecosystem displaces verifiable knowledge. Second value is emotional response. And here I'm talking more about social media, though this is also increasingly infiltrating the mainstream media, especially television networks, right? Does what I'm seeing make me feel good? Make me feel entertained and relaxed? Or alternatively, does it make me feel angry or anxious? It turns out that feeling angry and anxious leads me to want to view more of the same. Could this really be the case? I've got to learn more about it. Or that's outrageous. Tell me more. And on social media in particular, where the business model is click, 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 right? Keep staying on the page, keep in the stream. Having somebody hooked on an emotive response is a very good way to keep their eyes on that stream. The dopamine feedback loop is a very similar idea, except it's being described at the neurological level, right? Dopamine is a neurotransmitter. It's a neurotransmitter that gives rise to a sense of pleasure. It's the neurotransmitter that you feel when you take an illicit drug. It's the neurotransmitter that you feel when you hit the jackpot on the slot machine. And it's not surprising, given those two examples, that dopamine tends to be associated with addiction. And that one of the things that the designers of our applications have figured out is if they can get people to get a dopamine hit from being on their application, they will stay on their application for longer and return to their application on a regular basis. And so as opposed to the professional ethics of verifiable knowledge determining what gets into our media and information systems, these values, identity confirmation, emotional response, and dopamine feedback, are more and more governing what gets out there in important quadrants of our media and information systems. And having said that, I don't want you to think that I am overgeneralizing, that this applies to everything that's out there. When we look at and compare Fox with MSNBC, with CNN, with ABC, we see a gradation of the amount of false news, with Fox way out in the lead, MSNBC second, and then CNN, ABC much more reliable, right? And so similarly, I think most of the mainstream media, including the Wall Street Journal, as well as the New York Times, as well as the Washington Post, are in fact continuing to maintain the ethics of verifiable knowledge and to police each other for falsity, right? And so that's the way a well-functioning media ecosystem works. And that's still the majority of media in the United States today, except for social media, except for Fox News, except for important sectors of the right-wing media ecosystem. But the result is that a third, 40% of the American population can regularly be led to believe something that is absolutely false, but nevertheless, in some sense, satisfies their need for identity confirmation or the right kind of emotion or the right kind of neurological feedback. Additional factor here, cognitive overload, right? That there's just so much information out there. And I started today talking about this idea from Ezra Klein that Biden is the anti-Trump in the sense that he's avoiding the media spotlight. He doesn't want to be the center of attention or the conversation, but that he's being quite aggressive in pursuing a relatively progressive policy agenda. And in a sense, precisely because that policy agenda is not strongly associated with him, it's not polarizing us, right? We see the policy for the policy and recognize, wait a sec, the $1.9 trillion stimulus and coronavirus relief bill has a lot of stuff in there I like. And Republicans are willing to acknowledge that when it's not Joe Biden's stimulus and relief package, it's just the American stimulus and relief package, right? And the result is that there's less of a constant stream of news. In a sense, the policy details don't get us worked up the way in which the personality stuff does. And so it feels like there's less news out there right now. But we're used to 4 years of drinking from the fire hose with Donald Trump, right? Constant story, scandal, new revelation, and this sense that it's just too much to keep track of it all, right? What are the details of the Ukraine scandal? How do they differ from the Mueller inquiry? How do they differ from the current friction within the administration, et cetera, and so on? That there's just too much to keep up with. And the result is that people become overwhelmed with the amount of information they have to process. Now, I want to be clear. I think there are two independent variables that are at stake when we think about cognitive overload and its prevalence in our historical moment. One of them is the nature of the public sphere, the information system, the new media, and the fact that anybody who wants to can put anything out there. That means that there's just a lot more out there these days. But I also think it's the case that there's increased complexity in our politics. And I'll just take the simplest example, right? We're in the middle of a coronavirus pandemic. A year ago, most of us hadn't heard of the idea of a coronavirus. And of course, we have to deal not only with the coronavirus and the vaccines and the controversies around the effective public health measures, but mutations or variations in the coronavirus, and the question of whether or not those mutations and variations might defeat the vaccines. It's just an awful lot of new knowledge to have to try to assimilate. And this illustrates the point that in a global technological world, the news that we have to process to be up to speed with what's happening in the world is itself more complex. And so it's not just that there's a lot more information circulating because it's become so easy to put it out there. It's also that what we need to know has grown in both volume and complexity in the 21st century. And so this then raises a question, and it's a question that Nicholas Carr really helps us to focus on. Are we witnessing a transition between two modes of thinking? And the idea of a linear mode of thinking is best illustrated by reading. When I read an article in the newspaper, when you read a book or a magazine, we can see, in a sense, the way your attention operates by following your eyes. And what we see is you go in a very linear fashion. You start at the beginning, you go to the end of the line, you go down to the next line, and you continue. Now, you might say to me, of course, that's what reading is, right? Well, that's what reading the printed word on the page is. And I tried to illustrate a little bit last week that this is a relatively new thing, that this was probably not adaptive for much of human history to be so focused on just that thing directly in front of you that in a sense the rest of the world goes away while you're reading the printed page. And I pointed out to you that when we do fMRI studies, functional magnetic resonance imaging studies of what's going on in the brain while you're reading, that you're having a simulacrum of the experience that's being described to you. If you're reading about Lawrence of Arabia traversing the Sahara Desert and the heat beating down on him, it turns out that the same neurological pathways in your brain that would be firing if you yourself were in the desert and experiencing intense heat fire. They fire much more weakly. You don't start sweating and need a lot of hydration, but you are having a kind of echo of the experience you're reading about. And that reflects the fact that, in a sense, you have tuned out the rest of the world and you are immersing yourself in the world that the words on the page evoke. And that is a rewiring of the capacity for attention the human brain contains. For much of human history, the vast majority of human history, paying attention like that puts you in peril, right? You needed to be sensitive to rapid changes in your environment, whether it was a predator or an enemy or a poisonous snake. You had to be constantly alert to what's going on around you. And paying attention in that focused kind of way prevents you from doing that, right? And so we have reworked our attention to be able to engage in linear thinking, linear information processing. And when we do that, right, when we expose ourselves to a journalist or a novelist or an economist or a sociologist, an art historian, making a sustained argument across pages, we in fact acquire the capacity to begin to think like that. That it doesn't come from nowhere, the capacity to follow a complex argument and then the capacity to make a complex argument. We get it because we practice it by reading. And so when we talk about linear thinking and its correlation with the act of reading, this is the idea that we train our attention, we train our capacity for reasoning and argumentation by engaging in the activity of reading the printed word. When we read on our devices, when we spend time on our cell phones and our computers, we stare at a screen. Sometimes that screen has printed words on it. Sometimes it has images or videos on it. Sometimes it has video games on it. By the way, for what it's worth, the video gaming industry has become the most profitable entertainment industry in the world, more profitable than the movie making industry. And so I imagine that most of you don't play video games regularly, but for an awful lot of people, this is one of the main things that they do on their screens. And when we are on our screens, even if what we're doing on our screen is reading more or less, or maybe even exactly the same text that we would be reading on the printed page, when you study the eyes of the reader, you see that they are doing something different. Their eyes are jumping around. They are looking not only at the stream of letters, but at the hyperlinks, right? That the underlined blue things that call your attention to another article. You are quite likely to follow that hyperlink. By the way, if you are reading on your phone, you get messages, you get alerts, you get other applications vying for your attention. And even if you're unself-conscious about it, not aware, your eyes are jumping to other things on the screen at the same time that you're reading. And the suggestion that Nicholas Carr is developing based on recent neurological research is that it's changing not just the way we read, what we do when we have that time, but the way in which we think. And I have suggested that the metaphor already of scuba diving versus jet skiing, that networked reading is a social act performed with constantly fractured attention. You're not just by yourself alone in the world of reading, you're reading something that you recognize as a shared public text being read by a whole bunch of other people at the same time. And that the fact that you can comment on it and see what other people comment on it actually changes your relationship to the text. You're no longer interested primarily in unpacking its argument or its narrative. You, you are as much interested in making the right kind of comment on it, and then what people who see your comment will say about your comment. Thumbs up, thumbs down. Facebook, it's worth noting, doesn't really have the thumbs down button. Smiley face, heart. These are very simple reactions. Or will they actually write something in response to what you've written, and will that create a new kind of proliferation of discourse about your comment? And so networked reading is different from reading on the printed page, and it may be doing different things to our minds, to the way in which we think. And the other big shift that Nicholas Carr points our attention to is the idea of writing for the sake of feeling or belonging. Right. And so the sense is that you're no longer writing to explore your inner depths and truths, or to make a convincing argument, or to reveal something about the world that has not been noticed by anyone before. As opposed to that, this is a kind of communal act that expresses an emotion. And so one of the ideas here is that the tribalism of American politics is related to the way in which we're acquiring our knowledge, our information, and the habits of mind that it develops. So let me conclude, and now we're moving into newer material, that Carr suggests that in a sense, in an earlier era, there was an implicit dialogue or dialectic between the silent reader and the private writer. That the person writing the novel sat in the confines of their study for years on end, carefully crafting their narrative in anticipation that one day it would be published and read and appreciated. Whereas today, when you write for social media, you hit send or publish, and instantaneously what you wrote 1 minute is out there the next minute. And so there's an immediacy to writing now that makes it much more a social or communal act, much less a private act. And at the same time, the person reading is reading knowing that you just published it and that they can comment on it, and their comment can be instantly available. And so the idea of silent reading is also being displaced by an entirely different way of relating to text, to content. And that the result is that the attentive reader and the modes of writing and the novel and the essay, right, grow up during the period of the Gutenberg technology, when we can have more readily available access to the printed word. And this affected modern culture. I've already suggested that the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, the scientific revolution, humanism are all contemporaneous with the explosion of the printed word in Europe, right? And that this reflects the fact that modernity, to speak more broadly, and I want to speak specifically, there's a German social theorist who talks about modernity 1 versus modernity 2. I don't need to go into the details right now, but the idea that modernity as involving a kind of sensitivity to the self, a kind of effort at self-exploration, and that this involves autonomy and authenticity, right? The idea that one has to be true to oneself, the idea that one has to be in charge of and directing one's own life, central modern cultural values perhaps grow up in tandem with the kinds of writing and reading that are characteristic of modern society. And if we are shifting the way in which we read, if we're shifting the way in which we write, perhaps our culture is beginning to show the effects of these changes in the way in which we acquire knowledge and the way in which we require the habits of thought that come with the way in which we acquire knowledge. And so one of the questions that Nicholas Carr poses is whether a postmodern age is inevitable once we enter the era of digitally mediated communication. And it's obviously not just Nicholas Carr. There are a whole bunch of people writing about this. Sven Burkett, in his book, Changing the Subject, I think does a very nice job with this as well. But does the fact that we are instantly publishing, instantly reading, instantly commenting, surfing across the surface of text, jumping from text to text, lead us to be more playful, more superficial, less serious, less deep, morally and intellectually, as a result of the way in which we're relating to knowledge and thereby relating to the ideas of other people? Do we tend to be more ironic about the ideas that we receive? They come so fast. They seem to be written so tentatively, just as kind of experimental feelers to see how people are going to react, that this doesn't seem like a deeply sincere mode of communication. And so it evokes an ironic attitude in response to it. Finally, when we publish things in the age of the internet and social media, are we sincerely committed to revealing deep aspects of ourselves, what we truly believe, what we believe others should believe as well? Or are we just trying on a pose? Are we, in the words of contemporary theory, performing ourselves to see what the reaction is? Do we become then more performative, less committed to what we publish? That I'm going to publish this today and this tomorrow, or maybe this morning and this afternoon, just to see what reaction I get. There's no deep sense that I have a unified argument that I'm going to unpack over years, so much as just the flavor of the moment, the soup du jour that I'm going to ladle out, see if people like it. If not, I'll try a different thing tomorrow. And so that this is changing our culture in profound ways. Now, I want to spend the remainder of today introducing you to one more thinker. And maybe you've heard of him before. This man's name is Timothy Wu, Tim Wu, he goes by. He's a professor of law at Columbia University. He specializes in science and technology law, as well as intellectual property law. In 2006, so quite a while ago, Scientific American named him one of the 50 leaders in science and technology. That was because he had well, I shouldn't say because, but one of the bases for him getting this award was the fact that Tim Wu had recently coined the idea of net neutrality, which you may have heard of, which actually was a doctrine that was put in place because of Wu's formulation of it by the Federal Communications Commission in the early era of the spread of internet technology and social media, and then was undone quite recently by the Trump administration. He's a prolific writer, deeply knowledgeable across a whole bunch of different fields. The Master Switch, which is about how information empires are organized and compete with each other. The Curse of Bigness, making the case that we need a new era of antitrust law, are both very influential works. But the one I want to focus on is The Attention Merchants. And this is about a whole model of business that Wu thinks has come to be one of the dominant models and is at the same time not well understood. And so we're beginning to transition into the political economy of the internet, right? How this business model works. And I've already suggested to you that there's kind of a mystery here, right? Which is to say, we have now corporations, Google or Alphabet, which is now the holding company that includes Google, Facebook, which are among the most highly valued companies in the world. Their valuation is in the high tens of billions, right? And yet they don't seem to sell anything, right? Google, get it for free. Facebook, get it for free. How are they making money? And Wu, in a sense, sets out to answer that question in his book, The Attention Merchants, and he suggests an important business model, which he thinks goes all the way back to the penny presses of the early 19th century in Britain and the United States. And so it's worthwhile noting that to this day, you do not pay as much as it costs to make a newspaper, right? The business model does not depend on them selling the newspaper for more than it costs to make it. And obviously, making a newspaper is not just printing it, it's paying the entire staff of reporters and editors, etc., who typesetters are involved in actually creating the product. And for most of the 18th century, and including the 17th century, when newspapers really start to take off in Europe, newspapers were much more expensive. They tended to be trade journals or things that were bought only by merchants or those who were quite wealthy. And that there's this innovation that occurs in the 19th century, if I've got my period right, in Britain and the United States independently, but around the same time, which is that a new breed of newspapermen decide we can make money not simply by selling the paper, but by selling advertising in the paper. And so, as opposed to a newspaper costing a dime, all of a sudden a newspaper costs a penny. And as opposed to it being a dry, primarily trade publication, all of a sudden the stories become quite salacious. And Wu points out that in the early days of the penny press, there were all kinds of totally fabricated stories. You know, scientists have discovered how to see to Mars, and what they see is Martians on the surface of Mars. And here are some illustrations of what they're seeing, right? Completely made up. Sold more newspapers, I think this was the New York Post, than had ever been sold before. And all of a sudden, the advertising revenue is going through the roof, right? That's the new business model. Don't worry about trying to make a profit by selling the product itself. Get the advertisers convinced that they have to purchase advertising in your journal because your journal reaches so many people. And when they read it, they can't help but also read your advertisement. There it is in, hopefully splashy colors with splashy images. This is the start in many respects of aspects of the sexual revolution as marketers decide that the best way to sell their products is by showing attractive, usually women associated with the product, right? And so this is an entirely different business model. As Wu puts it, what is being sold is not the product itself, but your attention. The product, the newspaper, is just a vehicle for capturing your attention and delivering it to the people who have paid for access to your attention. That's how the newspaper makes money. That's why in the golden age of television, when you just put rabbit ears on your TV, you could get television for free, and yet CBS, ABC, NBC were hugely profitable corporations. That's why Google and Facebook are among the most highly valued corporations in the world today, despite the fact that they're not selling anything. They are selling something. They're just not selling it to the user. They're selling it to the advertiser. What they are selling is access to your attention. That is what they are cultivating and harvesting, packaging and producing. And that business model is fundamental to understanding what's going on in the media world today. Now, I'm going to present you with a diagram that is way too dense for you to make sense of it. This is my effort to synthesize some very important ideas that Wu helps us to understand. And please don't feel like you've got to unpack this diagram all right now. That makes no sense. But I want to try to introduce the central ideas, and then I'll spend a few minutes unpacking it. So I am creating 4 boxes that have to do with 2 dimensions in which attention can vary. In terms of the control of attention at the level of the individual, it can either be self-directed. I determine what I'm going to pay attention to, or it can be automatic, reflexive, or distracted, right? And so automatic and reflexive, something flutters in the periphery of my vision where I don't think there should be anything fluttering. Immediately, my head turns, my eyes shift, and I'm looking over there, right? And so that is automatic and reflexive attention. Alternatively, I think we've all had the experience. We're trying to read something, we're trying to think about something, we're trying to make a list of the things we're supposed to be doing today, and we completely lose track of what it is, right? I had my medical exam this morning, and on his way out, the medical examiner left all the results on my kitchen table. I had to run after him, right? He was distracted by something. We are obviously accustomed to being distracted, hopefully not all the time, but upon occasion. And that's as opposed to self-directed attention. I am not going to be distracted by anything. If something flutters in the periphery of my vision, I don't care. I'm going to keep reading my article because I've got to get it done. I'm going to keep grading that paper because the grades are due at midnight tonight, right? And so attention can either be self-directed or in a sense automatically directed by the brain. When we say self-directed, there's some sense of will and decision behind the place where we're going to concentrate our attention, where we're going to focus. Now, here's a separate variable that has to do with the duration of the attention, right? Is it sustained or is it transitory? And I hope this is clear, right? The idea here is that different people can pay attention for different lengths of time, and that the capacity to really concentrate for a long period of time, as opposed to being flighty and flitting from here and there, right, is something that takes cultivation, something that takes practice and development, something not just that the individual has to work on, but that a culture tends to either cultivate or instead not encourage in individuals, right? And so two dimensions of contrast in the nature of human attention. Is it self-directed or distracted or automatic? Is it sustained or transitory? And these two dimensions can overlap with each other. So you can have sustained self-directed attention. I'm going to sit down and I'm going to read War and Peace for 4 hours this evening. Leave me alone. I've got my hot cocoa, a warm blanket, good reading light. I'm just going to do it, right? Or it could be self-directed but transitory. I really want to grade those papers, but boy, are they boring. Oh boy, I've done it for 20 minutes. Now I'm going to go do something else because they just can't hold my attention, right? It's still me saying, I'm going to go do something else. I'm going to go read War and Peace because it's a lot more interesting than my students' papers. But at least I'm in control, but I'm not able to muster that self-directed attention for a long time. Similarly, we can have sustained distraction, right? We've all had days like that where I just can't get anything done. I'm worried about something, and so I can't hold my mind in one place. Or we can have transitory distraction, right? And so the idea here is that there are 4 possible ways that human attention can manifest itself, and that in a sense, and I'll just be very brief about this, that the Renaissance, humanism, the Enlightenment, the scientific revolution, and the democratic revolutions occurred in a period where we had a literary and letter writing public, where we read novels and books and essays, and we wrote letters to each other, and we took pride in the idea that we were readers and writers, and that the democratic constitutions of the 18th and 19th centuries were written for people with this kind of attention. And that as a result of the digital media revolution, we are increasingly inhabiting an age of distraction, automatic attention, not being able to pay attention for very long. And so we've gone from one kind of attention being encouraged by our information system and media to a very different kind of attention. And of course, in the United States, we still have that 18th century Constitution that was written for people whose attention was shaped by a certain kind of media system and public sphere. But our media system and public sphere is very different today than it was 240 years ago when the founders sat down in Philadelphia to generate our Constitution. Is it perhaps the case that some of the fractiousness, some of the willingness to believe the manifestly false in our politics is being produced by the way in which our attention has been transformed? I'll leave you with that question for today. I do want to have a few minutes for you to make your comments, ask your questions. I am going to unmute everyone now, so please note your background noise will pick up. Who wants to start us out? Yeah, Chet, go ahead. Chet, you're going to have to hold your space bar down or hit that mic. There you go.
I'm surprised.
Chet, try talking. Let's see if we hear you.
Mike.
There you go. You're. I can hear you now. Go ahead.
Lost him again.
You okay, Chet? I can hear you.
Where is he?
Now I'm having trouble hearing you. Try hitting the space bar and holding it down, Chet. Good. Okay, give me a second. Let me see if I can do something here. No, I don't think I can do it on my end, Chet. Do you have that little microphone icon? I think you got it. No, as soon as you do it, it goes back away.
Onto it like that?
Yeah, that's it. That's it.
Okay. Earlier you said 43 states considering changing their, I think you said voting laws. And I didn't understand at that point, how are they changing them? In what direction?
Well, for instance, we had much more absentee voting or voting by mail in 2020 because of the pandemic. And people who are advocates of voting access, like voting by mail, right? More people vote when you vote by mail. People who study this say there's almost no voting fraud, and it makes really no difference whether you vote by mail or in person, right? And so objectively speaking, voting by mail does not open us up to vulnerabilities in our voting system. But in many states right now, they're considering eliminating the option to vote by mail or radically reducing the conditions in which you qualify to request an absentee or by mail ballot, right? And so that would be one example. It's not per se that they're saying you can't vote, right? That's unconstitutional. That's not allowed. But how can you vote? How many polling stations will there be? Can you do it in person? Will you be required to show identification? These are the kinds of measures that are being considered. And the people who study this say when you pass these kinds of measures, fewer people vote, and it disproportionately impacts different groups. So in particular, poor people, people who are from racial minorities, are less likely to be able to have the time to go to the distant polling station or have the relevant kind of ID or proof of residency. And so it depresses voter turnout, and it has disproportionate effects in terms of who votes. So those are the kinds of legislation that are being considered. And, you know, to be clear, I think that for many of our elected officials, they read the same stuff we read, and they're aware that these measures don't address a non-existent problem, the problem of voting fraud, but because these measures are advantageous to certain parties. And please note that in all 43 states, this legislation is being sponsored by Republicans, right? Because Republicans at the national level do better when voter turnout is low than when voter turnout is high. This is an excuse to pursue measures that will suppress voter turnout. So yes, that's the background. Thank you for asking, Chet. It's a good question. Anybody else with a question or a comment?
I have a comment to make.
Please.
naturally.
It wouldn't be a complete lecture without a comment from you. Go ahead.
You mentioned briefly the measures that Biden is trying to pass. Now, is the opposition to that because of his personality, or is it the contents of the measures?
So I guess we got to ask about opposition from whom, right? And so it does appear, right? The House of Representatives passed the Biden stimulus plan, and they passed it mainly on partisan lines, uniform support from Democrats, just a little bit of support from Republicans. It's gone to the Senate now. As you may have noted, there was a legislative maneuver that was designed to delay it being passed. But it is extremely likely to be passed, and probably in the next few days, and be passed on strictly partisan lines. 50 Democrats will vote for it, 50 Republicans will vote against it. Kamala Harris, the vice president, the president pro temp of the Senate, will break the tie, and the legislation will pass 51 to 50. If we're asking, why do those 50 senators oppose it? I think the simple answer is partisanship, right? That this is a bill sponsored by a Democratic president, supported by the Democratic legislature, drafted by committees controlled by Democrats, and they don't like it because it's a Democratic bill. But if we look at the American population as a whole, this bill has support from roughly 80% of the people in the United States. And it has support even from around 50% of registered Republican voters. And so I don't think that the people of the United States are opposed to this legislation. It's only their representatives from one party who are opposed to it, and they are opposed to it for a variety of reasons. Some of them pure partisanship, right? Which is to say, this would be a win for the Democrats. Some of it has to do with fiscal conservatism and the idea that $1.9 trillion is an awful lot to spend, and that if it doesn't prove to be economically productive, we may be on the hook to pay this off for the next generation, and that's unfair. Some of it may be opposition to specific measures in the legislation. And so the reason that the Republicans in Congress are opposing the legislation is complex. I think the reason that the American people are in favor of it, by and large, is to do with what the legislation would do: give new stimulus checks, increase the availability of healthcare, do things to support the infrastructure, right? There are things in this bill that are very popular, irrespective of party or partisan identity.
So in other words, the population really doesn't have a say in the matter. Their representatives are against it, although their voters are for it.
Well, and that is often the case in American politics, right? And so one of the questions is, why is it that the representatives have been unsuccessful in convincing their voters to oppose it? And that's where I was pointing out that Biden has been very clever in not being strongly associated with this legislation, because if it were Biden's legislation, let's take the example of Obamacare, right? Obamacare refers to the Affordable Care Act, but it became so strongly identified with a particular individual that if you were a Republican who didn't like Obama, you probably didn't like Obamacare, even if you liked everything in it, because you didn't like the person who devised the legislation and was trying to get it passed. Biden has managed to avoid being closely associated with this legislation, and the Republican representatives have failed to get him more closely coupled with it. But I think one of the things to notice is that Congress is in session 270 odd days a year, right? There's an awful lot of time we're not paying attention to what they're doing, right? That's the nature of a representative democracy. And we don't demand that our politicians do everything we want them to do on every last detail of legislation. The kind of accountability we tend to have in a representative democracy is retrospective accountability. If you really screw things up, we're going to kick you out of office, right? And so there's some possibility that there may be retrospective accountability for Republicans who oppose this legislation if this legislation turns out to be very popular and very successful. But it doesn't mean, I think, that representative democracy is broken down, that the Republicans are right now opposing this legislation.
Okay.
I have a question. You hear me?
Yes, I do. Go ahead.
Am I wrong, if very correct in saying that many years ago, I don't know exactly what, we never had mail-in. We always had, you had to go to a certain place to vote.
Now.
So that, can you explain that? We never had absentee, well, law forces in certain instances where you had to do it by mail.
Yeah, so I'll tell you, in the late 1980s, I went to graduate school in England, and I wanted to vote. And so I got absentee ballots from the state of California, which is my home residence, and got them delivered to me in England, and went through a lot of effort to get them back to California on time. Absentee ballots used to be a much narrower category, right? For reasons of work or military service or education, you were not able to be present in your home district during the election. But I'll just tell you now that California and Oregon and a number of other states have universal, right,